This is London. The beef eaters may have become spam eaters, but no one has seen Scrooge about tonight. Our men have been giving parties for British children. They have made toys of odd bits of wood and metal. Big, tough sergeants have played Santa Claus. Thousands of British children, especially the orphans and the poor, have had a memorable time thanks to the Americans. Some of them are a little homesick, but you couldn't tell it by looking at them. I've asked many of them what they'd like to say if they were talking to America tonight. And most of them have said, well, you see, it's a little tough to know what to say. But you know how it is. I've an idea. Most of them would tell you, don't worry too much. We're all right, and we're amongst friends. And some of them on this dark night might repeat the words written a long time ago. Though there be darkness, it shall be as the morning. And thou shalt be secure, because there is hope.
Edward R. Murrow, broadcasting live from London, Christmas Eve, 1942. This is a special Point of the Spear presentation, Christmas, 1942. We'll hear more radio excerpts and clips from Command Performance, a War Department program broadcast to American troops around the world on Christmas Eve, 1942. Our main feature is my interview with Danish author Peter Harmsen about his book, Darkest Christmas, December 1942 and a World at War. Our special Christmas 1942 gets underway next. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Welcome back. And before we get into the show, remember to click that follow button on the podcast to be notified of our future fantastic guests like the author we're speaking with today. And thank you. Today's guest is the author of the New York Times bestseller Shanghai 1937, Stalingrad on the Yangtze, and other works. He studied history at National Taiwan University and has been a foreign correspondent in East Asia for over 2 decades. His latest book is called Darkest Christmas, December 1942 and a World at War. And from just outside Denmark, author Peter Harmsen joins us now. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Before we get into the specifics of Christmas 1942, give us an overview of the atmosphere. It was very uncertain at that time, wasn't it?
Well, it depends on what perspective you adopt. I mean, if you look at it from the point of view of the modern historian, of course, the turning point of the war, or the turning points, more correctly, had already pretty much been passed. Like in Alamein, for example, the British had beaten Rommel. The Allies had also landed in Northwest Africa. If you go to Russia, the German Sixth Army was surrounded at Stalingrad, and in the Pacific, the Japanese were in retreat both in New Guinea and in Guadalcanal. So if you look at it with the benefit of hindsight, there wasn't really a whole lot of uncertainty. But in my book, I'm trying to use the contemporary perspective, trying to look at the war, the way it looked to people who were actually in the middle of things at the time. And if you use that perspective and, for example, read the diaries or the letters that people wrote in those times, you realize just how uncertain it still looked at the time. You could, for example, sit in the middle of the United States or in the Midwest, and you might be worried that this might be your last Christmas in freedom.
Is that what you used as a lot of the source material, diaries and letters for the book?
Yeah, to the greatest extent possible. I tried to use contemporary sources. I also used memoirs by people who had participated in the war. But to the greatest extent possible, I used the sources that were written at the time, whether it was letters or diaries, or, for example, contemporary newspaper reports, just to give some of the flavor of what the time really felt like to people who were living through things at the time.
Well, that carol came from some of the men of the Eighth Army, and it was sung from the borders of Tripolitania. And I don't want you to get the impression that the 8th Army is just having a nice picnic and is going gaily singing carols up the road after Rommel. We are a good way at the moment behind our forward troop, who certainly won't be going about caroling tonight. And Christmas, although it will be remembered and celebrated in the desert, won't, to be quite honest, be an affair of plum puddings and merry crackers and parties and good feasting for the men of the 8th Army.
BBC correspondent Godfrey Talbot with the 8th Army in Tripoli, December 26, 1942. Now, people's behavior was at both ends of the scale. There was great kindness shown, but there was also great cruelty. Can you give us some examples of some of the kindness and some of the cruelty?
Yeah, I can give you one example that actually has both aspects of human behavior in it. It's about a Jewish resistance fighter in occupied Poland who, as darkness approached on Christmas Eve, 1942, was walking through the cities of Krakow. At the time, he had just been in. He had a close shave with the German police, who had managed to shoot him in the leg, but he had succeeded in escaping from his pursuers, and now late in the afternoon of December 24th, he was like walking through the streets of Krakow, trying to blend in with the crowd, but actually feeling, of course, the intense pain from the wound in his leg, and even feeling that he was like gradually losing consciousness because of loss of blood. So of course it was a desperate situation for him. He had to find refuge somewhere, and the first his first thought was to like walk into a Catholic church. His idea was that of all the days of the year, probably the time where you would find some kind of compassion would be, especially from a Christian priest, would be on this very special night. But he was turned away by the priest of the Catholic Church. You can probably, as a modern reader, it's probably to some extent understandable. I mean, helping a Jewish resistance fighter would, entail the death penalty if you were found out. But still, it was kind. You could also characterize it as a somewhat callous act, especially on a night like that. So this Jewish resistance fighter just had to move on, walking through the streets that were now emptying of people. Eventually, he found an apartment building and managed to get inside, and simply like collapsed on the staircase. And the people inside the apartment building, of course, also were scared. They knew that this was probably someone who had some dangerous business with the Germans, and helping him entailed great personal danger. So a few people slipped out some food to him, and others were just standing over him. But now it was completely night, complete dark inside the staircase, and he was inside the building, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness, and overheard small bits of conversation from people who were like watching him in the dark. For example, one person saying, "Just leave him there. He's dead anyway. He'll be dead by tomorrow." He was saved at the last moment by the concierge, who came out from her apartment and hastily ushered him into her apartment and gave him a bed to sleep and to recover. So this is, I think, a story that like encapsulates both things, both great callousness and also great kindness in a very extraordinary time.
And he survived, obviously, to write the story of that experience. Right.
He moved to Israel after the war.
We'll be back in a moment.
Command Performance USA, the greatest entertainers in America, as requested by you, the fighting men of the United States Armed Forces throughout the world. Command Performance, presented this week and every week till it's over there. All during 1942, Uncle Sam's shortwave stations and radio networks of the United Nations have been shooting out this big show to you guys who are shooting it out with the Axis. From the fog-bound Aleutians to the steaming jungles of the South Pacific, you've written thousands of letters to Command Performance, and the letters were answered in person. Well, there's a victory committee here in Hollywood whose pledge to that worldwide victory committee of yours is, "Buddy, your request is our command." For this 1 hour on Christmas Eve, a man and woman you call Mom and Dad become part of your show. For tonight, for the first time over the 4 great networks and independent stations, the War Department of the United States of America presents Command Performance. At this moment, the Chief of the Office of War Information has a brief message. Go ahead, Washington and Elmer Davis.
On this Christmas Eve, all over the world, American soldiers, sailors, Marines, and nurses are listening to this program as they have listened for almost a year past. But tonight, it serves as a link between them and us at home. We're all hearing it, the whole American people, whether in the cities or on the farms or on ships at sea or in army camps or at the front.
And we'll hear much more from Command Performance during the remainder of this special. This coming week, be with us for our last episode of the year, as we finish the year strong with Chloe Gavin Beatty, the youngest daughter of World War II General James Gavin.
Well, one of the stories that veterans like to tell me about Normandy is that there's a soldier in a foxhole, they're under fire, and someone just jumps into the foxhole on top of them, and he starts saying, "Who the heck are you? What are you doing, you idiot?" And my father said, "General Gavin." He said, "Well, welcome to my foxhole, sir."
Remember to click that follow button on the podcast to be notified when the episode releases. How about on the German side? Were there things that were happening in the prison camps that were unusual?
Yeah, one episode that especially struck me and was actually one of the episodes that motivated me to write this entire book was what happened at Auschwitz during Christmas 1942. There's especially one incident that really struck me because it showed the kind of like the absurdity of the Nazi view of life and the proper behavior towards fellow human beings. They put up like a big Christmas tree in the middle of the camp, and what happened next is it's been described in various sources, and they're not exactly the same. So it's what I write in my book is kind of taking bits and pieces of different sources that I think sound relatively plausible. But one of the camp guards ordered a number of prisoners to strip off their coats and fill these coats with sand and carry the sand from one end of the camp to the other, like completely meaningless work. It was simply a means to exhaust these prisoners. And while they were doing this, they were beaten and whipped by German prisoners and the capos. Several of these prisoners collapsed during this work, and by the moment they collapsed and fell to the ground, they were like thrown into a ditch with ice cold water and froze to death. Afterwards, the Germans pulled out the dead bodies from the ditch and placed them onto the Christmas tree, saying this was a Christmas present to the Poles. This is, of course, an incident that shocked the people, the prisoners who watched it. I have one testimony from a German prisoner who said afterwards that after watching this, he would never be able to look at Christmas with the same eyes again. That Christmas would never be a time of joy ever again.
I can see why that would motivate you to write this book. Were there other reasons why you wanted to focus on the Christmas holiday?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about war, and which makes war perhaps more interesting than any other activity, is that it gives us a much deeper knowledge about what it really means to be human, like brings both the proverbially best and the worst in people. And I think this is even more the case when we are talking about Christmas in wartime. Like some people are reminded about the original Christmas message and become even more willing than usual to put themselves at risk to help their fellow human beings. I mean, I have some examples of this in my book. For example, there's one incident about a unit of Australian soldiers in the New Guinea jungle who spent Christmas helping some of their injured comrades back to for medical treatment in the rear. And of course, at risking their own lives in the process, and afterwards saying that, seeing these bodies being brought back to safety was the best Christmas present they could ever have thought about for themselves. So this is like one example of how these the best of human behavior is actually emphasized in times of Christmas. But then on the other hand, there's the other way around, where some people use Christmas to become even worse and to like start playing cruel games, like the example I mentioned about the Christmas tree at Auschwitz.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Bob, Command Performance Hope, telling all you soldiers, sailors, and Marines that although Johnny Doughboy found a rose in Ireland, what he really wants is that stinkweed in Berlin. Yes, sir, it's a great thrill and an honor to be on this Command Performance show on this Christmas Eve, the time of year when everyone has a feeling of love. Boy, you should see all the young couples walking in the park, the fellow with his arm around the girl, and the man from the draft board with his arm around the fellow. But fellows, back home here, the women are making this a victory Christmas. My aunt is very patriotic. Yesterday she gave her girdle to the scrap drive. Now she's dreaming of a wide Christmas. And everything about my aunt is patriotic, even her dog. The other day he chased me down the street, finally caught me and bit off the seat of my pants. Thank heavens it was Meatless Tuesday. But all the women are patriotic these days, and they're all doing their part. Today, wives are no longer backseat drivers. No, sir. They sit up in the hood now with a straw and siphon the gas tanks of the cars in front of them.
How did Christmas 1942 differ from later years of, say, 43 and 44?
Well, the reason why I used Christmas 1942 and not one of the earlier years was that Christmas in 1942 was the first truly global war Christmas. Until 1941, it wasn't really a truly global war. It was two separate regional conflicts, one in Asia that had erupted in 1937 and one in Europe that had started in 1939. What really brought these two conflicts together was the entry of the United States into the war in late 1941. Of course, December 1941, the United States was not yet engaged throughout the globe. It was only something that happened in the course of 1942 as tens of thousands of American soldiers were shipped overseas to the Pacific and to the British Isles. So you can talk about December 1942 as being the first time where you could actually like move around the globe and time zone by time zone describe how different parts of humanity were marking Christmas at war. Then about whether or not Christmas 1943 or 1944 could also be equally interesting. I think what really struck me as interesting about writing this book was that, in times of Christmas, it's a little bit like your birthday. You think 1 year back and you think 1 year ahead. You think about where were you last year and where will you be next year. Well, the problem is at war, you don't even know if you will be anywhere next year. You don't know if you'll be alive a year from now. So there's this like basic uncertainty associated with Christmas that really like intensifies this charged emotional atmosphere that you find yourself in. This, I think, was like slightly less pronounced in 1943 after the great German defeats on the Eastern Front and the fall of fascist Italy and the beginning of the U.S. advance across the Pacific. So I think 1942 was really a very special year in this respect.
Well, men, this is Bob Hope, speaking from the USA. This is the land that not long ago had boundaries. An ocean on one side and an ocean on the other. Douglas firs and deep snow and good fishing to the north. Blue water and lilacs and hot weather and cotton fields to the south. You lived and worked inside those boundaries and thought it would always be that way. You worked at the shoe store in Peoria. Yet tonight you're over there in England and North Africa. and you fly hell out of your bomber and go through God-made storms of snow and rain and man-made storms of steel and fire. And then you ride home to this radio program and say, please do a song for me. You were the clerk in the local grocery store, the young doctor starting out, the history teacher in Grand Rapids, the mechanic at the corner garage. Yet tonight you're blacked out on a freighter or standing guard over your brother along a path in the jungle. You were the guy who had never been in Nevada. Yet tonight you're at home in Fairbanks, New Delhi, and Chongqing. But, well, that's the way it goes these days. For the boundaries of land and water have vanished from all nations. And in their place, a single boundary of freedom is moving across the earth as God meant it to be. But because of guys like you, when we think of America, we still think of Douglas firs. Because you guys are like those Douglas firs. And you're like the good fishing in the lakes and Coney Island and the cornfields and smokestacks. And you're like the little towns with the red water towers, and like Mount Rainier and Yellowstone and Highway 66, because all those things are American. They were part of you when you left, and they will still be part of you when you come back. The stuff that makes Americans. And brother, they don't make better stuff anywhere in the world.
Is there a story from Christmas 1942 that stays with you and may have a meaning for us or a message for us today?
Well, there are several different, but I think one in particular is one that takes place in Western Germany near the border with France in late December 1942. Actually, December 24th, 1942. It's about a German teenage boy, actually a member of the Hitler Youth, not by choice, because it wasn't a choice. You had to be a member of the Hitler Youth, but a good German Nazi boy who went skating with his friends on the first day of the Christmas holiday, and on the way to the frozen pond where they planned to go skating, he came across a construction site manned by Russian slave labor. In particular, he saw one young Russian woman, of course, completely emaciated by work and malnutrition, holding a small baby. This boy, who was also, of course, reared in the Christian faith, immediately had associations with Virgin Mary and the Christ in Bethlehem, and just thought that this Jesus, at least at the time of his birth, had a warm manger to find himself in, whereas this Russian child was, almost freezing to death. So this German boy went back later the same day and collected food that he wanted to pass on to this woman. So he went back to the construction site, but was unable to find the woman, and was immediately chased away by a German worker, telling him that as a good member of the Hitler Youth, he should know that he wasn't supposed to help the enemy in this way. So, of course, it's a sad story, because he didn't actually succeed in passing on food to this woman who probably died along with her child. Mm-hmm. But it at the same time, it shows that small acts of resistance and defiance are possible everywhere. They can occur everywhere, and any person can probably rise in defiance of evil and injustice. Yeah,
one kind act like that can have ramifications and influence other people. That's for sure. Yeah. The book is called Darkest Christmas, December 1942, and a World at War. Peter, thank you so much for being on the show today, and a Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you. You too.
And happy holidays to you, my listeners. I hope you've enjoyed this special presentation, Christmas 1942. Be here next time as we close out the year strong with Chloe Gavin Beatty, discussing her father, General James Gavin's wartime diary, which has just been released as a book. We'll close out this Christmas Eve 2022 with Dinah Shore from Command Performance, Christmas Eve 1942. And I'll see you next time.
Hiya, fellas. Well, it's not the same old Christmas Eve without you. But when we take down those little trees in that front room you left behind, the lights will keep on burning in that window in our hearts. My New Year's resolution is to keep on answering those wonderful letters you write to me, care of Command Performance. So for the Flying Fortress Mob at APO 875, for Colonel Ned in Alaska, for good old Pat Wing 7, for all the jungle mutters down in Panama, for Hayes and Snyder and the Air Force gang in China, for Mac, Red, Clancy, and T-Bone, somewhere north of the farthest point north, for Colonel Ed, Marge, and Little Shug, and for all of you everywhere, this suggestion: as long as you're not in love with anyone else, why don't you fall in love with me? As long as you're not in love with anyone else, why don't you fall in love with me? You're driving me crazy, baby, trying to guess. Will you tell me no, or will you tell me yes? You gotta go overboard for someone someday. Believe it or not, it's bound to be. As long as you're not in love with anyone else, why don't you fall in love with me? As long as you're not in love with anyone else, please, why don't you fall for me? You're driving me crazy, baby, trying to guess. Will you tell me no, or will you tell me yes? You gotta go overboard for someone someday. Believe it or not, it's bound to be. As long as you're not in love with anyone else, why don't you fall in love with me?
Command Performance has been a presentation of the War Department of the United States of America. These are the radio networks and stations of the United Nations.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.